Hello everyone, and welcome to the third webinar in our Tools for Peace series on nonviolent communication as a tool for systematic transformation. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to welcome you. I am Eve. I'm part of the team at SCI's International Secretariat, and I am one of the moderators today. My colleague Claudia is also here to support the technical parts and the Q&A later, the chat for today. Before we get started, a few technical announcements. This is a webinar recorded. Your camera and mic are off, so we can't see you or hear you during the webinar. The webinar goes for 90 minutes. Timo and Laura will present for 60 minutes, then we would have 30 minutes Q&A. In the meantime, you can send your question at any time. And we will answer them later. The chat will be open for you to interact, but if you have a question for the Q&A, please ask in the Q&A box. Now, I'll just take a couple of minutes to introduce who is behind the organization of this webinar today. So, we are the International Secretariat of Service Civil International, a volunteer organization dedicated to promoting a culture of peace by organizing international voluntary projects for people of all ages and backgrounds. SCI is open to all and it has no political or religious affiliation. We envision a world of peace, social justice, and sustainable development, where all people live together with mutual respect and without recourse to any form of violence to solve conflict. Our volunteering projects include work camps, long-term volunteering programs, training courses, and local events. Today's webinar is part of our project Peace in Diversity, co-founded by Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Peace in Diversity aims to build the capacity of volunteers, activists, and youth workers on peace and nonviolence that will support their work with diverse groups, teams, and communities. The project includes 3 main activities: 2 in-person training courses, one which just took place in Antwerp last week, and today we're welcoming you to the third activity of the project, the Tools for Peace webinar series. It is a series of online events, webinars, aimed at equipping young people with practical skills for practicing peace, conflict transformation, and nonviolent communication in diverse communities. We are motivated to share some of the learning from our project with a wider audience, and that's what we are here today with you. The webinars are meant to be practical, where you would have the opportunity to immediately implement the learning outcomes in your private and professional life. So here today we have Laura and Timo, who will delve into nonviolent communication as a tool for systematic transformation, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Eve and Claudia, and to SCI in general also for hosting us, for making this possible, for inviting us. And yeah, welcome again also from our side to everybody who is joining us. I'm seeing like over 70 people, and in the chat I'm seeing a lot of different countries. So that is super cool that you're all here and that you're taking this time. So thank you and welcome to this webinar on nonviolent communication as a tool for systemic transformation. And just for you to know like who we actually are. So my name is Timo and I use he pronouns. And I am part of a small political collective in Barcelona that is called Degrowth in Action. And among others, we're doing like non-formal education on different topics such as oppression, degrowth, global justice, but also nonviolent communication and transformative justice. And with me is Laura.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura. I go by they pronouns. I'm also based in Barcelona. I came here for a master's in political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice. And I also work with degrowth in action on different topics, doing political education on, capitalism, systems of oppression, degrowth, queer liberation, and international solidarity.
So what's on for today? Just like a quick outline so that you know what you're in for. In a second, we'll quickly just show you some of the main objectives of today. And then we will start with a bit of a general introduction to NVC, so to nonviolent communication. Like, what is it? Where does it come from? Then we will walk you through the 4 steps of NVC that are kind of like the main pillars of NVC. And then, since this webinar series is on social change, we want to link it a bit, like what are the links between NVC and social change? And then we also want to critically reflect a bit on this concept and ask what's next for NVC. And then in the end, there will be a Q&A session for the last half an hour and ending at 7:30.
Yeah, so to start with the objectives of this webinar, first of all, an objective is for you all to get an understanding of how nonviolent communication works and what its basic steps are. Secondly, to reflect why nonviolent communication is transformative on various levels. And lastly, to critically reflect also on the concept of nonviolent communication.
So before we kind of jump into the general introduction to NVC, we thought it may be nice to invite you to take 30 seconds to answer these 2 questions just for yourself. So I'd like to invite you to take a moment and see what emotions do you feel right now, and maybe can you identify what your needs are in this very moment. And it's just for yourself to reflect. No need to write it in the chat. Just tune in you with yourself. Take some seconds. See where you're at. And we're going to do the same. So always a bit challenging to hold this silence, especially when we can't see your faces and your reactions. But so thanks for doing this with us. Maybe for some that was a bit easier, for some maybe that was a bit more difficult. Maybe you didn't really have words for your emotions, or you didn't really know what the needs are. Hopefully you will have a better understanding of this at the end of this webinar. But let's start with a general introduction to NVC. What NVC is, so like NVC stands for nonviolent communication, and NVC is the abbreviation, and we will from now on normally say like NVC, which a lot of NVC practitioners also do. And what it is, you can think of it as different things. So NVC, I normally think about it as a concept or as a framework. You could think of it as kind of like a structured approach to understanding and addressing human interaction. And that's why it would be a concept or kind of like a framework. But there's also other views. So for example, you could see NVC also as a language, because NVC focuses a lot on communication. You could also see NVC kind of as a way of life, as a philosophy, because NVC has certain beliefs, certain kind of like worldviews that are also valid beyond communication. So it's like, yes, it's a language, but it's also more than that. It's also coming with certain understanding, certain views of the world. And so you could also see it as a philosophy. Has nothing to do with Marxism. The little Marx icon is just to illustrate philosophy, and also because I'm a fan of Marxism. And then lastly, you could also see it as a tool for social change, which also the kind of creator of NVC always understood it as. So for example, NVC is used in mediation, conflict resolution, but also in different ways. And we'll also, as I said in the outline, we'll look at this a bit more later. NVC was created by Marshall Rosenberg, who you see right here. And he was a mediator, psychologist, and he was developing most of this framework throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and then later published a book which kind of like took this framework and put it into this book, Nonviolent Communication and Language of Life, published in 1999, so quite a bit later. And Rosenberg was a white male psychologist and mediator raised in a Jewish family on Turtle Island in Detroit, and growing up in the 1940s. So kind of like in a time when there was a lot of racial segregation, and this is then also kind of like the context that he was in, seeing a lot of violence, a lot of oppression, in which he developed this framework. And here you see the book again, this Nonviolent Communication, a Language of Life. And NVC has a lot of different influences. For example, mediation and like Rosenberg's mediation practices, but also humanistic psychology that also always focused a lot on relations, on kindness to others, but also to yourself. But NVC also draws a lot on indigenous knowledges. For example, Rosenberg mentioned like the concepts used by the community of the Ojibwe. And many different indigenous communities have long used like relational, empathetic approaches to communication. And a lot of people have pointed out that Rosenberg could have also been way more explicit in highlighting these influences from indigenous cultures or knowledges for his approach, for his framework. And then lastly, the three words that I've written there at the bottom, these are three very central elements of NVC. So empathy, feelings, and needs, and kind of like empathy, understanding it in the sense of really giving space to somebody's feelings and needs without putting your own judgment. So really holding space for another person, really being there, fully present. And today we're just going to talk about the foundation of NVC because it's just a 90 minutes webinar, and we can basically only cover like the groundwork, the foundation, the cornerstones. But there's a lot of resources on NVC out there. So just kind of like to invite you to, if beyond this webinar you remain interested in this topic, there's a lot of very practical guidelines out there that you can dive in. A lot of podcasts, a lot of material already exists to just have a look at. And this book, we, like both Laura and I, are both big fans of this book. It's very also practically written. But yeah, so if feelings and needs are such central elements, then we wanted to take a look at what that actually means. So like, how does NVC kind of like conceptualize it? And we wanted to look at it using the metaphor of an iceberg. What we can see on top, so the top part of this iceberg, what is above the water is a person's behavior. So that we can normally observe in other people. We can observe them complaining, maybe laughing, interrupting. All of these types are behaviors. But what we don't really see is what is hiding underneath the surface. At the waterline, what we can sometimes see and we sometimes can't see are the feelings of people. So they are already kind of like underneath the behaviors that we observe. So maybe a person might feel curious, a person might feel angry, sad, or anxious. And underneath even the feelings, so in the part of the water that we, or like of the iceberg that we can't observe normally at the surface, are the needs. So people might feel a need for shelter, a need for autonomy, for connection, for a need for purpose. And maybe this wording might be new to you, like thinking in feelings and needs. But so what NVC basically says is that these two things, feelings and needs, are something that is universal to us as humans. So we all share a certain set of feelings and we all share a certain set of needs. Even though in different moments, different people might experience might experience different needs being stronger in them. So maybe a person might experience a stronger need for purpose at a certain moment, and another person might experience a stronger need for connection. But overall, we all share these feelings and needs generally in us. We all can feel curious, we can all feel angry, we can all feel sad. We will also see later kind of like a list again, like what with different feelings and with different needs, because yeah, we have often lacking a bit the vocabulary. Maybe just one example to go through this iceberg again is to say that let's say you're reacting to your flatmate who has again not washed his dishes. Then maybe on the top part, like above the water, the behavior that you're observing is, or like that you might engage in, is you might ignore your flatmate all day. But this ignoring that might be driven by the feeling of being angry or being annoyed. And this feeling, in turn, this might be driven by a need that is not fulfilled. So in this case, maybe the reason why you're feeling annoyed is because you have a need for order in the flat, and this need is currently not fulfilled when your flatmate does not do the dishes. So important to, like, the important takeaway from this iceberg, the needs are at the core and they influence how we feel, and this in turn influences how we behave. So our visible behavior really is only kind of like the top level. And now, before we go into the actual 4 steps of NVC, we wanted to take a second to also look at some typical problems of communication when not using NVC, and how it's typically blocking empathy. And again, there's like a lot to say about how our communication that we're generally using, why it's often not working or what its problems are. So these are just like 5 examples of how our communication doesn't really work so well. For example, we often use judgmental language. So instead of empathizing with people whose behavior we maybe don't understand or that we don't agree with, we go on to judge them, we analyze them. So for example, we might say in this example that I used earlier, my flatmate never never does the dishes because he is lazy. So there I just like jump to a judgment instead of empathizing or trying to understand why this is happening. We also use often overly rational language that is very disconnected from feelings. And like while putting this presentation together, I was thinking of a last time that I met my dad, and my dad was telling a story about how he had gone to a literature class for the first time. And then when I asked him how he felt going there, he said, yeah, there were a lot of new people and the teacher was also great. Which both is very interesting, but it's also not how he was feeling in that moment. And I think this just illustrates something that is very present in our communication, that we're kind of like lacking an awareness of our emotions, and then also maybe we're lacking the vocabulary. So a lot of people, maybe also in this call, might know more swear words than emotions. Maybe something that you can think of for yourself, like as an exercise after this webinar. Another thing is that we often interpret instead of trying to understand. So for example, you might find yourself saying to your partner something like, you didn't make any one-on-one time for me this week, you don't love me. And so there you just like interpreted their behavior instead of understanding them. Another mechanism that for example, I can observe a lot in myself is that we get defensive. So when confronted with feedback, we rather than like instead of trying to understand what the other person that is confronting you with some feedback or some criticism, instead of trying to understand what they are feeling and what they're like where they are coming from, we go into argument mode, and like trying to spit some facts out there, kind of like say why that is not a valid point, rather than trying to connect with the other person's emotion. And last thing to point out or to highlight is a lack of responsibility. That in our language, we often kind of like make ourselves very passive, and don't really take responsibility for our own actions. So think of a parent who says, I yelled at my child because the child ran onto the street. In this example, this parent is then saying that it's the child that is responsible for the yelling because it ran on the street, right? Instead of maybe saying, I yelled at my child because I was worried because my child ran on the street. So there's kind of like a mechanism in which our communication becomes passive and takes responsibility away from our own actions. Yeah, these is just like to give a bit of a backdrop of why maybe we need NVC. Yeah, so the question is, if our current language and communication is not so great, how could we do it instead?
Yes, so how could we do it instead? Well, lucky for us, nonviolent communication is developed in a way with 4 very clear and strong components, and like 4 parts or 4 steps that I called it here of nonviolent communication. And those 4 steps are firstly observations, then feelings, then needs, and then lastly requests. And so the observations are the concrete actions that we observe that affect our well-being. Feelings are how we feel in relation to what we observe. The needs are the needs, values, desires, etc., that create our feelings. Like Timo mentioned before, that in this iceberg model, you can see that the needs are basically behind the feelings. And lastly, the concrete actions that we can request in order to enrich our lives. We will go through all 4 of these steps in a bit more detail, and we will also keep using this example of the flatmate and the dishes. But before we do, we would also like to invite you to take 30 seconds again and to think about a minor conflict situation that you recently had, for example, with a friend or also with a flatmate. Maybe also use this time to get a paper and pen if you want to, because we will go through this, and it would be nice maybe for yourself also to write down while we go through these steps. Yeah, so take 30 seconds to think about it. All right. I hope you're not too upset about the situation that you're thinking about right now. That it's a bit of a light situation, hopefully. Okay. Also, as a bit of a like helping hand, a sort of guide, like Timo mentioned already earlier, that sometimes it's quite difficult to have the vocabulary ready for our feelings and for our needs, because it's not so central in our daily communication normally. And so these are 2 screenshots from the Nonviolent Communication book. writing down some basic feelings that we all have. In the top, you can see on the left feelings when our needs are fulfilled, such as amazed, comfortable, confident. Then we also have feelings when needs are not fulfilled, such as angry, annoyed, or concerned. And then on the right, we see some basic needs that we all have. So this is some kind of universal set of basic needs or of needs, which can be something related to autonomy, choosing your own dreams, goals, etc. It can also be related to very material, like physical materiality, such as a need for air or for food. Timo will now send a PDF of this as well in the chat. So when we go through these exercises, you can also use this maybe to help yourself find the right words. Yeah. Did it work, Timo, sharing it?
Still loading.
Still loading, okay. Then I will slowly move on to our first step though, namely the observations. Observations. What are we observing others saying or doing? That is what observations are. And with this first step, it's important to share your observation without any judgment or blaming. So really just try to observe what's happening. And so you could start your sentence with I see or I hear, etc. Okay. Then in this example again of the flatmates, maybe the conventional way to speak would be my flatmate never does the dishes. However, making an observation using NVC, so without any like judgment, it would be I see that my flatmate's dirty dishes have been left in the sink for 2 days. You see a bit this, well, quite clearly, I hope, this difference between these two sentences. And then now I would like to invite you again to, with this case that you have in mind, this minor conflict situation, to write down what your observation is. So the observation that applies to this. Again, you have 30 seconds to write it down. All
By the way,
right.
so welcome to everybody who joined later. I saw like a lot of people still joining in the last like 10-15 minutes. So very cool that you're here and that you're joining us.
Thank you. All right. Now that we all have our observations, we go to step 2, which is feelings. So a question that you could then ask yourself now is, how does this observation make you feel? And here you could use the A4, that the sheet that was sent in the chat. Some feelings are anxious, or maybe you're feeling happy, frustrated, etc. Important to note here is that very often we might think that we're expressing our feelings, whereas we're actually saying something that we can refer to as non-feelings. And especially in the English language, it's very common to say, I feel like you're ignoring me, or I feel ignored, even though that in itself is not a feeling, because there's already some kind of interpretation. This was one of these pitfalls that Timo was mentioning earlier of our conventional way of communicating. And so this can be quite difficult to change. And very often the I feel like can be replaced with, for example, I think, and it's more thought and not so much a feeling. This is not to say that like NVC is here to try and like correct people, like, oh, you're not using the right words. But it's more like exposing, like, okay, with this information that you're giving me right now, I don't actually know what you're feeling, or like you might yourself not actually know what you're feeling. And if you're saying, I feel ignored, maybe you're actually feeling frustrated or you're feeling anxious, which then helps more to try and understand like what you need also. And so for this step, your sentence could just start with I feel, and then fill in the blank. And so to go to the example again is, yeah, the non-NVC way. We could say, I feel like I always do your dishes. But again, this is showing that like we're using the word feel even though we're not describing a feeling or an emotion. And so using NVC, we would say, I feel frustrated and a bit overwhelmed. All right, then now get your paper again and take 30 seconds to think about what you feel about the observation that you wrote down earlier. Okay, 30 seconds. All right. It is indeed a bit interesting, like Timo said before, to not see your faces. But I hope everything is going well. And that we can then move on to the third step, which are the needs. So what needs are behind our feelings? Yeah, a feeling is always a result of either a met or an unmet need. Yeah, examples can be a need for support, respect, shelter, etc. Again, feel free to look at the A4 that was shared earlier. And yeah, a sentence could then now, after I see or hear, and then your observation, I feel, and then following that, because I need or I value, well, something. And so again, to illustrate this with the example, the non-NVC way would look something like this. I need the dishes to be clean. But the NVC way would look more like, I need more order in the rooms that we share in common. And yeah, this just shows like you're keeping it also more with yourself. Like this is a need that you have, and not necessarily imposing it also on someone else. Yeah. Well, you know the drill by now. Take again 30 seconds to write down for yourself what need applies to your case. Good luck. All right, then moving on to the fourth and last step of NVC, which are the requests. So here you can think about what would actually make me feel better. And that addresses exactly this. And it's important to also understand for yourself, but also maybe when someone is making a request to you, is that a request is not the same as a demand. And so this means that the answer can also be no. And a no, it's also interesting to perhaps try and not hear a no as a rejection, but a no as an indication that the other person or you yourself when you say no is that you have a different need, and so you can just like try and peel off all these layers that are behind this no. Yeah, and so a request is not a demand. And so you could phrase this along the lines of, would you be willing to, and then fill in the blanks. And so for the example, well, the first one is a very, very clear demand. Go clean your dishes now, which is, well, quite violent in communication style. And so a request would be, would you be willing to clean your dishes? Okay, then for the last time, now take 30 seconds to write down your request. Okay, I hope by now you've all completed these 4 steps of NVC. And so just to have an overview of it again, so these are the 4 steps. And with the example that we've been using, the full conversation would be, or like conversation, the full sentence would be, first your observation. So when I see your dirty dishes in the sink for 2 days, I feel frustrated and a bit overwhelmed because I have a need for more order in the rooms that we share in common. And then the request would be, would you be willing to clean your dishes? Okay, now I have only mentioned how to express yourself using NVC. But what's really cool about NVC is that you can also use this to receive when other people are talking to you. And what this means is that even when someone else is not using nonviolent communication, that you could still remind yourself of these 4 steps. So whenever someone is talking to you, you can try to actively look for the observations or the feelings, the needs, and even maybe the requests that are behind what the other person is trying to tell you. And there are different tools for this. Like you can, for example, ask questions or like paraphrase, like, hey, do I understand you correctly that you're feeling like this? Or does it mean that you maybe need this? Or would you want me to do this? Yeah, that can also be a very helpful way of making a conversation, even when the other person is not expressing themselves maybe according to these steps. Yeah. Okay, then now that we've been very practical about this, I'm gonna give Timo the floor again to talk about NVC and social change.
Thank you. I would be so curious to know like if this worked well like for you all with the conflict that you had in mind, and maybe you can bring these 4 steps into reality and kind of like even resolve the conflict using this tool in the future. Yeah, so in this webinar series, it's about learning different tools for peace and for social change. And so in the next minutes, that's kind of what we want to look at. And in my opinion, or in our opinion, there's so many different things that we could say here. So this link between NVC and change, or like social impact or social transformation, however you want to call it, I think that it's very strong, and there's like a lot of things to say about it. And so kind of like the what I'm going to share in the next minutes is just some of the things that we wanted to highlight. But I think once you've understood a bit how NVC works, you will also just be able for yourself to think how this positively impacts, or that could positively impact your life and this of others, and like bring societal change also. And the 3 levels at which we want to look at is the individual level, then kind of like a group or organization lens, and then seeing what changes at a society level this could bring. Starting with the first, I wanted to bring you this quote from Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was one of the founders of humanistic psychology and was one of the main inspirations for Rosenberg. And the quote goes like this: "When someone really hears you without passing judgment on you, without trying to take responsibility for you, without trying to mold you, it feels damn good. When I have been listened to and when I have been heard, I am able to reperceive my world in a new way and to go on." And I think that this quote just really well captures what NVC feels like, or what receiving empathy feels like. So this feeling of somebody really making space for your emotions and for your needs, and to really be seen, to really be heard in these emotions and needs. This is just a very strong feeling. It's maybe a bit hard to describe with words, but it's a strong feeling that that I think is just already transformative and kind of changes something in you, can resolve things in you, can release things, and just feels very good. A couple of things to more things to look at this kind of individual level. So using NVC, what does this bring? What is the impact that it brings? One, through NVC, you understand your own emotions way better. So you have a lot more emotional clarity. You get to know yourself better, and through this, it's also easier to be compassionate with yourself. You also learn ways in which you connect with other people, because at a deeper level, because you're connecting with them, with their emotions, with their needs, and this basically means that you can foster connection at a deeper level. That somebody once said to me, you connect in a land beyond judgment, and in this land, connections can just be stronger, and foster also stronger relationships. By kind of knowing your own emotions and your needs, and also hearing for the emotions and needs of other people, you're also able to care for yourself more and also care for other people more, because you can try to fulfill other people's needs and your own needs, and be in harmony or alignment with these needs. As we said in the beginning, if you think of the iceberg, feelings are kind of the outcome of your needs. And if your needs are fulfilled, then this can bring you positive emotions. So if you have a need for connection and then you really genuinely connect with someone, that brings you probably a feeling of maybe joy, happiness. And so having this NVC framework and using it can just generally bring you more positive emotions to kind of go through life with, which is just pretty nice. It can also bring advantages for your mental health, because NVC really tries to not be judgmental, and this also means no judgment, or trying to not be judgmental towards yourself. And therefore, maybe you can let go of feelings of guilt, feelings of shame that you might have in yourself, and this might benefit your mental health. And also, we all have kind of patterns that we were socialized with. For example, as a male person, to put your needs above others, or to take more space than others. And looking at the emotions and needs and using this framework can help you unlearn such socialized patterns. And then these kind of three dots are just to say that there's so much more that we could say here, because ultimately, just think about all the miscommunication that happens between people, and normally we don't really even know like where the roots of our conflicts or of our negative emotions are, and having suddenly a framework that allows you to investigate this and like to even go there and like even resolve it just brings a lot of impact. On an organizational level, so I was thinking here mostly in terms of what does it bring like for a grassroots activist organization or activist group, but maybe you can also think about it in terms of an NGO or even maybe as a company or something. NVC, yeah, it's just like a powerful tool to prevent and to resolve conflicts, because you really try to understand each other's emotions and needs. And by preventing and resolving conflict, this makes groups way more resilient, makes groups more cohesive because it allows people to be closer together. And if you have groups that are more resilient, that are more cohesive, that have less conflicts, ultimately this also just means you have more effective groups. So you can engage in more effective activism if you're not always like held back by interpersonal conflicts. It also, and here I'm really thinking of activist groups, it enables communication beyond political differences and allows for broader alliances. What I mean with this is maybe you can think of how well can you communicate with people that don't share your political beliefs, or that don't share like your cultural values, your social values, your political values. Like how well can you actually communicate with people that don't share your political beliefs? And having NVC as a framework might allow you to still work with people that you don't share this with, and go beyond these disagreements. Also, another point is that NVC allows for emotions to be part of organizing, which I think in a fucked up state of the world that we are in, with ecological breakdown, rise of fascism, and all this shit, a lot of exploitation, oppression, it's really important to bring or like to have enough space or to hold space for emotions and like to let ourselves also grieve. And NVC gives us the framework to do that also on a group level, because if we don't make space for these emotions, I think there's a very quick road into to burnout or into despair, and I think we really need these spaces for grieving. And the last point to mention on this level is that NVC is also, or can be at least, a pillar for more horizontal structure. Maybe it's easiest if you think about this with an example of a company. And if you imagine your boss and you both communicating on the basis of your feelings and needs, rather than basing it on hierarchy, this is kind of like a powerful tool to equilibrate a little bit, or like to move more towards a more horizontal structure and abolish hierarchies. Although it also comes with some pitfalls, which we will see later. And then the last level to kind of mention is the society level. And the effects here, or the impacts, is just really if you're thinking of, okay, if NVC was like a bit more widespread in society, how would that then work out? As you probably all know, in a lot of countries, there's a lot of polarization. And using NVC to connect with our shared humanity and connect with emotions and feelings, instead of just like seeing the actions or seeing what people say, allows us to move kind of beyond these differences, and to also hold more class solidarity beyond differences that there might be otherwise. And we see also might bring a switch in terms of culture or like values, from a culture of competition and domination towards more of a culture of empathy and a culture of cooperation, which, if you think of how we got into the situation of ecological breakdown and exploitation, which is like very dominated by systems or like by values and cultures of domination, often like these alpha male politicians and billionaires and their values, this would be actually like a very necessary cultural switch towards more empathy, care, and cooperation. In my opinion, it also allows to reproduce violence less. And maybe as an example, think of someone who was physically violent. Then while like obviously like this violent behavior is kind of like fucked up, it might still be driven by an unfulfilled need to feel secure. So like this person might have like underneath the action, remember there's feelings and needs that are driving this. And so knowing that ultimately this person's action was driven by a lack of security, this allows to maybe fulfill this need for security, which might then in the future prevent violence from happening again. Although, of course, like in such cases of like physical violence, like this might not be the only framework that we want to use. And I think Lau might say something about this, and also our next webinar. Yeah. Also, I'm looking a bit at the time. So maybe I'm just gonna say the last, like one more of this list, and then we kind of skip the last 2 points. A tool for leftist politics and against right-wing capture of people. Yeah, this is a bit similar as the one before. I think a lot of studies show that people that vote for right-wing parties, that they're actually driven by a deep feeling of insecurity, which in the neoliberal system that most of our Western societies are based on, is of course like a very widespread feeling. Like you have a lot of austerity measures, like all of the social measures are cut, like all of the social spendings are cut, and then people, they are just like feeling insecure, and then this leads to them voting for right-wing parties. Well, of course, not the only reason, but one of the reasons. And then as leftists, if we want to kind of like get these voters back, then it might just be more effective if we know what the underlying feeling. Yeah, maybe I'm skipping the last two and over to you, Lau. Some technical problems. So bear with us for a second while we figure this out. It's not moving to the next slide.
Okay, there I am. My computer was not popping up the option for me to unmute myself, so that was a bit difficult. But yeah, thanks so much, Timo, for sharing all these points about all the strengths that nonviolent communication basically has, like on an individual level, on a group level, and on like a societal level. However, we do think that there are parts that can be critiqued about NVC. And so now we want to take a bit of time to, share with you our main critique, or to put differently, where we think the next step lies for nonviolent communication. And so to already say it, our main critique is that nonviolent communication doesn't inherently address power and privilege. We think that, or like we see that power dynamics shaped by systems like sexism, ableism, classism, ageism, racism, speciesism, so much more, determine whose voices are heard and also whose needs are prioritized. And unfortunately, NVC doesn't magically erase like all these systemic inequalities, which means that without addressing it and without resisting those systems of oppression, they will for sure play a part in our conversations, like anyway. And to illustrate this also a bit more, like imagine an able-bodied white middle-class man with a university degree and a disabled Black working-class queer person. And in our current system, the former is likely to have been socialized in a way to feel good or at least entitled to take up space, express his needs, and will also, through the actual design of our system, be more heard and prioritized. Meanwhile, the latter may have been socialized to minimize expressing their needs, remain silent, or actually also through this system just be silenced. Yeah, and so that just brings us to the key criticism that we have and we see, and there are more, and maybe through listening to this webinar, you have already thought about a few, and then we would love to hear them also from you later during the Q&A. It basically, and we see, it tends to assume that everyone involved in a conflict or in a conversation can equally express their feelings and needs, which is sadly just not the case. Yeah, so it would be great if we would create also a language that centers around like fighting systems of oppression together. And then to also have a bit of a, like, so to say, constructive outlook, looking at these limitations that we mentioned. We still find it important to say that while these critiques are super valid, they don't necessarily invalidate nonviolent communication. We still believe that NVC is a super important tool for fostering empathy and improving communication, but just on its own, it's not enough. It needs to be part of like a larger framework. And so some ways that we think that NVC can grow and evolve to address power and privilege are firstly to integrate power into the framework. So it needs to explicitly address power and privilege as part of its language and its practice. And so this means acknowledging these systemic inequalities that I mentioned earlier, and also recognizing how they influence us on a daily basis. Secondly, we would propose to combine NVC with structural change. So it should complement anti-oppressive practices like anti-racism, anti-patriarchy, disability justice, as well as like material actions such as strikes, mutual aid, collective organizing, because we think that this then ensures that personal communication doesn't replace this super important need for systemic change, and then it actually supports it. So NVC is then being used to create social change. And lastly, we would propose to focus on group accountability. So to prevent nonviolent communication from being solely an individual practice, groups, whether they are activist collectives or workplaces or communities, they can establish NVC guidelines that then everyone follows. And this reduces the risk of the burden falling on marginalized individuals to maintain like more compassionate communication. So in conclusion, while nonviolent communication for sure is a very powerful tool, it's not complete. It's not a complete solution to systemic oppression. And so for it to actually foster social transformation, NVC must be embedded in a broader politicized and anti-oppressive framework. And this is something that Timo and I will explore on our next seminar, which is on the 30th of January, also on Zoom, part of this webinar series, where we will discuss how nonviolent communication can be combined with transformative justice, which is a framework that is developed by Black, feminist, and Indigenous communities. And it seeks to address harm without punishment by transforming the systemic roots and thereby also fostering accountability. So that would also be like our invitation to join us. This was the end of our webinar, of our input. So now it's off to Claudia.
Thank you so much for your very clear and also practical presentation. We have one question, which I will, I don't know if it can be seen, but Lisa is asking, could you please once again explain the difference between a demand and a request? Is the former conceptualized as more violent according to NVC? This is the question.
So the difference between a request and a demand, I would say most clearly, you can understand it by the fact that if you phrase a request, the answer can also be a no. And so a demand basically leaves very little space for the other person to say, no, like I'm sorry, like I hear you, but I am not willing to do this for you. And then you can still explore what other options there are to try and satisfy all the needs that are involved. I didn't really get the part about whether it's considered then violent.
If it's conceptualized as more violent according to NVC. So I guess if a demand is considered more violent than a request.
Yes, I would say it is. Yeah. I hope the question is answered.
Laura, could you also say again the next webinar on transformative justice is on the
30th of January. So
yeah, okay. So Britta, yes. 30th
also
of
at
January.
6.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now there are also 2 new questions in the comments. I haven't read them before, so I will just read them to you now. So one is from the same person. I wonder how NVC could help with someone who is completely hesitant towards any form of conflict, even if it is healthy conflict, something that needs to be brought up. For example, if you grow up in a household of conflict, you may tend to be completely avoidant of it, even if it negatively impacts the quality of your life. So this is one question. So how can NVC help someone who is avoiding conflict? And the second one is, I am curious about how, say if you are very comfortable and knowledgeable of NVC, but the other person is not at all, or uses quite violent communication, how that might affect a conversation, or how might you still have an effective conversation using NVC? An example of this, just give an example of this. Thank you. That was also my question, so I'm very happy to see this, because I always wondered in this situation how it might work.
Laura, any preference to which question you want to answer?
The latter one I also find super interesting. But maybe Timo, I know you as well, so you could still say something after I said something. So like when another person is like not maybe like open to non-violent communication or is using violent communication themselves, like there are ways to like I briefly mentioned this, to receive something using the framework of NVC that can help you like empathize with them. But at the same time, I also want to say that this is also like not always an easy job to do. And if you actually want to or like you have a wish for like some connection, that takes two. Like it's not gonna be like you if you fail making connection, if someone else is really just like not ready to do this. Like it's maybe sabotage is a bit of a big word, but just to say that there are limits to this, and so please don't like blame then yourself for like not doing NVC well enough. That can sometimes just be very difficult. So yes, there are ways, but with its limitations. Yeah, I don't know, Timo, would you like to add something to this?
Maybe like to to try to make this a bit more concrete. Like, let's say there's a person and this person is kind of like super angry at you and yelling at you and for sure not using nonviolent language. Then let's say ideally you would try to give this person empathy. So you would basically try to see what is this person actually feeling in this moment and what might be a need below kind of this feeling or this expressed anger. And what NVC says, and yeah, might in reality sometimes work or like often work very well, but sometimes also maybe not, is that by trying to make like a genuine attempt at really connecting with the other person's emotions and needs, that the other person feels way more heard, and therefore this transforms already a bit. So you could maybe see like, oh wow, like I can totally see like that you're very angry that that this happened. I imagine that probably you really wanted to be seen in what you did in the household or something like this. So you're kind of trying to connect um, with the other person's emotions and needs, and for this you also just like very like need to be very present. And this might already calm things down, but it also might not. And there might also be situations like Lau just described in which it doesn't really work. And then I think it's also very important to give yourself also empathy, like to um, to see what you are actually feeling and what your needs in the situation is, and ask yourself also, do you have the capacity to be in this situation right now and to hear this, or like to be in the conversation? And the answer might also be, oof, you need a break. And you just like step out of the conversation for 5 minutes and then you step back in. Yeah. So these are just like some ideas or some thoughts to.
Yeah. And about the other question about, because I'm reading it now as well. So yeah, so about being hesitant to conflict and like growing up in a household, like, yeah, this is something that I think a lot of people can either recognize in themselves or in someone else. And my advice would be is to like if you experience this, or like if someone close to you experiences this, to yeah, try out nonviolent communication in like a safe environment. So to try it out with someone who also knows and is aware about nonviolent communication and practice. Because in the end, at least like how I have experienced it, or like how I'm still experiencing it, is that this communication is really like practicing a language, and that just takes a lot of fucking time. And there are days that I feel more fluent in it, and then there are days that I have the, yeah, I don't know, I have the idea that like I'm so bad at it. And so yeah, that just takes time, and having someone or multiple people to try it out with, and it's often also about yeah, just even already expressing your own feelings or like expressing your needs can already be like such a big step. If that's just something that you've never practiced before in your life, or you've never felt legitimate to do so or safe enough to do so, that can be like so transformative for yourself. Yeah, so that would be my advice, to try it out in a safe environment. Maybe then not like with your family members if you like have a household that had a lot of conflicts, but maybe with a friend or a, yeah, a partner. Yeah, to feel more comfortable with it. Yeah.
Maybe seeing, because we only I think have one other question, so I might also just add one thing to this question. Just from personal experience, I think I am a person that all my life I have been like very harmony seeking, and I have often avoided conflict. And then getting to know NVC helped me a lot, because one of the assumptions of NVC is all emotions and all needs are valid. And like, so however you feel in that moment, that is valid. And I think I was sometimes kind of like afraid of saying of expressing my feeling in a situation. And then just like this kind of change in my worldview changed then for my feeling of legitimacy and how comfortable I was with expressing that I felt that I had a negative feeling about something.
Okay. Thank you. And I would say also in general, MVC requires a practice for everything, to recognize your own feelings, to recognize your needs, the connection between the two, formulating the right observations. So yeah, from my experience, everything about it requires a little bit of practice. So there are more questions coming in. The first one is from, sorry about the pronunciation, I might be pronouncing it wrong, but Noah. So I'm wondering occasionally if you observe subtle forms of violence directed at smaller groups, such as immigrants and the LGBTQ plus community, from the boss at work. How could you address this issue? Additionally, how can you handle it, considering the company has no horizontal structure? Would you like me to read more questions, or would you like to answer this one?
You have some thoughts on this, Laura?
Yeah, but I already started now twice, so I thought I wanted to give some space to you.
No, like if you have some thoughts, like please go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, this is of course super shitty. Yeah. Yeah, if you observe this, I mean, first of all, like I think something that I would personally do is to maybe also talk with other people at work that you either feel trusted by, or like the people who are affected by yeah, these discriminations, and to yeah, maybe find some strength in sharing this together, all these observations. And then maybe also together, then you can think of how you would want to address this. If you don't have this, like if you don't have like other people that you can relate to, yeah, I think you can perhaps then maybe best assess yourself, like if you have the capacities to address what you would want to address, and to yeah, share your observations. Maybe yeah, like you can try and have a meeting with your boss, or with, I don't know how the structure then works at this place, but with I don't know, a designated person. And as a preparation, like I also do this sometimes, I just really write down these like steps of like these 4 steps. Like I write down my observation, and I write down how it makes me feel, and the need that I have, and the request that I would then propose. Yeah, so, and of course, like, yeah, if there's no horizontal structure, and you're like actively being silenced, this is like, yeah, what we mentioned, like a massive limitation. However, at the same time, I also think that phrasing or like making use of these tools might actually also be more effective than yeah, than just making demands, or expressing yourself in a very angry way. Not to say that there's no space for it, or that it's invalid, but it just tends to be easier for people to hear you if you express yourself in a way that other people don't feel like you're attacking them, or yeah, they don't think that they're being judged or being blamed. Yeah, so that would be my answer. Timo, do you have any thoughts on this?
I kind of like the structure of you like answering it already full blown, and then I just have to, I can like just add some minor things. Might sound controversial, but before you have this conversation, it might also help to use NBC, or like to give empathy a bit like to your boss, and ask yourself like, what need is this person trying to fulfill with this? And this might just like make the conversation easier. Like that doesn't justify your boss's feelings, your boss's behavior, but it might still allow you just like to to be also more calm in this conversation. And then also to say NVC does not solve everything, and maybe this is also a case for thinking for more material structures also. I don't know if there's like a workers' assembly or like workers' union and so on.
Great. So I will continue with the last question for now. So from Lila, while I often rely on NVC in my daily interactions and relationships, I sometimes feel that when it comes to frustrations with government decisions, NVC alone may not be enough to make our voices heard or drive meaningful change. Could there be situations where certain forms of confrontation or even violence might prove to be effective? And not to do an apology of violence, of course, but this is the question.
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I would just answer this like with a very clear yes. I like a bit like what we try to say with kind of like saying like with the part on criticizing NVC as a concept, we also just say like NVC is a super useful tool and kind of like underlying language for all of our activism and so on, but it needs to go together with other forms of like other forms and tools of resistance, and 100% like we cannot I don't know, dismantle fascist governments with NVC alone. So I don't know, like I think we are both very big fans of also material struggles, like really like strikes, direct actions, yeah, and yeah, maybe over to you, Lam.
Yes. Yeah, something that I would, or like something that I had to think about reading this question is something that's also mentioned in the nonviolent communication book, which is called the protective use of force, which I think can maybe like relate to this in the sense that sometimes some types of force or violence is also used to protect those that are marginalized. And like an example that I know from the book, it's a bit of a simplistic maybe example compared to like this big question about like frustrations with government decisions, and but that, for example, when someone like when an adult like grabs a child who is running across the street to protect them from not being hit by the car, like that is like a protective use of force. And so like maybe we can also just transcend that to like indeed like other forms of direct action that maybe are not the conventional way of like thinking about like nonviolence, but like yeah, direct action yeah, can then be seen as like, okay, where is this strategy also coming from? Like we're living in a super violent system, and so also if there are groups or organizations that that use this violence or force, like why is this? And even there, maybe now I'm a bit rambling, but I have to think about something else. Is that I had a conversation with a friend who's from Peru, and she also quite changed my perspective on this, where she said that people who were living off the land in Peru, like peasants, were violently displaced from their lands, which had like a massive impact on their life because this was their way of living. Like they sustained themselves by being in connection with the land, and yeah, a subsistence way of living. So like making their own land and living there with their communities. And the resistance movement at some point also murdered the land grabbers, basically the people who took over their lands, which is obviously horrific. And then what I found interesting is that I was then also even able to empathize with the peasants who were resisting and who experienced that their only way of reacting to this violence that was imposed on them was with other violence. And I think they're even like, yeah, like this empathy part of NVC is very very helpful. This was a bit of a detour. But I guess more to say that, like, yeah, it's not black and white at all. And I think these are conversations that we need to have and to explore. Yeah, okay, close.
Okay, thanks so much for answering all the questions, which we didn't receive more now. So maybe if you have any last words, you have a few minutes, and otherwise we can pass the word to Ev for the final remarks. So yeah, if you had anything you want to add, this is the moment.
Okay, I'm just gonna use this time then to just say, well, like personally for me, discovering NVC has been a really big change and like has been super impactful just like for myself, and that's why I'm also always like super passionate of sharing this, and so I can just like encourage you all like to explore this topic and also give yourself the time. But and the cool thing is that because it's kind of like a language, you can basically practice it every day. Like, so you don't have to wait for big conflicts. If I'm having a conversation with my flatmate and my flatmate had a shitty day, then I can still try to kind of like search for his feelings or for his needs underlying. So it's like something that you can basically practice in every day, and that's quite cool. And then I just wanted to quickly say, because we mentioned now this transformative justice webinar for next time, so I thought maybe I do a quick shout out and just like say in a few sentences what this is about, if that's okay. Allows sharing screen. Yeah, probably with the date. Yes, part 2. So like the two of us are giving a second webinar on the 30th of January about transformative justice. And just to say again, like transformative justice is basically a form of community accountability. So it's an alternative to punitive justice. So if some form of harm has happened, to then not go into this logic of, okay, now this person needs to be punished, but everything else stays the same, but to instead use a mixture of empathy and accountability, and those two things coming together and kind of like together bringing transformation. And so through this empathy, it's kind of like linking with today, and we think that it has a lot of overlap. Yeah, and it's practiced a lot by communities like abolitionist communities on Turtle Island, so what we normally consider as United States. Yeah, and would be super cool if you came there. Now that was a long statement. Lau.
Yeah, perfect. I also just wanted to mention that I put our emails there. If there's anything you want to talk about relating to these topics, you can reach out to us. Yeah, we will for sure share also the slides. And yeah, I guess I just want to thank everyone for joining, and of course also to SCI, thank you so much. I always find it quite special when people join these sessions at night in your free time. I think that's super cool, and gives me also, I guess, a lot of hope. So yeah, thanks so much for joining, and yeah, like Timo said, really hope to sort of like see you for the next session as well.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. It was super interesting, and definitely some more like question about it, like NBC and power dynamics, and also how there could be like some capitalization of feelings through like the development of NVC, but that's just my own side thoughts. But for this, then thanks everyone for joining us, and you will receive a recording of this webinar, and as you said, the list of resources and It has already been said, but the next webinar is on January 30th. And yeah, we hope to see you there. And I will now close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good evening.